Welcome to First Do No Harm with Massachusetts Citizens for Life board member and physician Dr. Mark Rollo. This broadcast will focus on medical ethics from a Catholic perspective and address abortion, physician-assisted suicide, contraception, natural family planning, IVF, healthcare proxy, and other topics. Please be advised that this show may not be appropriate for children under 13.
Hello and welcome back to First Do No Harm, a show about medical ethics from a Catholic perspective. I'm Dr. Mark Rollo. Last time I explored further the fetid fruits of the sexual revolution of the 1960s. This was explained in great detail in The Sexual State, a brilliant book by Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse. I discussed how much of what was described in this text was predicted by Saint Pope Paul VI, who made 4 prophecies in his watershed encyclical, Humanae Vitae. I ended the last show by reviewing the first prophecy. Today, I will examine the other 3 prophecies. I will also highlight some people who may surprise you in their agreement with Pope Paul VI. Let us first begin, as always, with prayer. For, as stated by the U.S. Catholic bishops, only with prayer that storms the heavens for justice and mercy, prayer that cleanses our hearts and souls, will the culture of death that surrounds us today be replaced by a culture of life. I present to you 3 reflections at different points of time in the past 52 years since the release of Humanae Vitae. The first reflection is from St. John Paul II in 1988. As we commemorate the 20th anniversary of Humanae Vitae, we see ever more clearly how relevant and positive it is. Pope Benedict XVI more recently. The truth expressed in Humanae Vitae does not change. On the contrary, precisely in the light of the new scientific discoveries, its teaching becomes more timely and elicits reflection on the intrinsic value it possesses. And finally, Pope Francis. The teaching of Humanae Vitae ought to be taken up anew in order to counter a mentality that is often hostile to life. O God, we pray for receptivity to the constant teaching of your Son, Jesus Christ, and the Church, which he gave to us. Amen. As I mentioned last time, in order to understand how we have slid so far as a culture, Dr. Roback Morse gives 3 explanations. Number 1, the separation of sex from childbearing, that is, the contraceptive etiology. Number 2, the separation of both sex and childbearing from marriage, that is, the divorce etiology. And number 3, the elimination of all distinctions between men and women, except those that individuals explicitly embrace. That is, the gender etiology. I believe that one logically flows into the next. Increasingly available contraception has made sex outside of marriage more likely, and the resulting infidelity led to a dramatic decrease in intimacy and increase in divorce. Contraception also led to abortion as a backup for failed contraception. sterility of sex reinforced the delusion of sameness between men and women. This coincided with a warped sense of feminism which sought equity rather than equality, sameness rather than complementarity. This is the current gender ideology, gender confusion, which exists today. These events would not have surprised St. Pope Paul VI. He prophesied them in his encyclical Humanae Vitae. Pope Paul VI was a sign of contradiction. Pope Paul VI made 4 prophecies in Humanae Vitae. The first prophecy was that if churches' teaching on contraception were ignored, there would be an increase in marital infidelity and a general moral decline. There is no question that the last 50 years has seen an increase in divorce rates, out-of-wedlock births, sexually transmitted disease, homosexuality, pornography, gender confusion, and abortion. The availability of contraception has led young people to believe that they can have sex responsibly. The terms safe sex and protected sex have become the mantras of today's hookup culture. Specifically, the moral decline consists of the following. In 1960, 5%, only 5% of births were to unmarried mothers. Now that number is approaching 40%. 40% of all births are to unmarried mothers. Divorce rates doubled from 25% of all marriages to 50% of all marriages during the decade of 1965 to 1975, when the pill became widely available. Increasingly available contraception has led to an explosion of abortion, not the predicted decrease. There has been a rising objectification and abuse of women. Sterile sex has helped rationalize same-sex so-called marriage. We have seen a rise in sexually transmitted disease rates in our hookup culture. We hear about safe sex and protected sex rather than committed and fruitful sex. Pope Paul VI's second prophecy was the loss of respect for women. It is truly ironic that so-called reproductive rights have been hailed as a boon for women, when the reality is a rise in exploitation of women, abandonment, and impoverishment of women. As stated in Humanae Vitae, it is to be feared that husbands who become accustomed to contraceptive practices will lose respect for their wives. They may come to disregard their wives' psychological and physical equilibrium and use their wives as instruments for serving their own desires. So-called reproductive rights for women are actually exploitation rights for men. Nothing says use me like the prevalence of contraception and abortion as a backup, and men have less incentive to marry and more incentive to abandon women. Women today in the hookup culture are expected to contracept and expected to abort if contraception fails. The third prophecy from Pope Paul VI in Humanae Vitae was abuse of power by government. He stated in Humanae Vitae, "Who will prevent public authorities from favoring what they believe to be the most effective contraceptive methods and from mandating that everyone must use them whenever they are considered necessary by the government?" Does this sound familiar? Remember the HHS mandate? This Obama-era rule, promulgated by HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, sought to force everyone to pay for contraception, sterilization, and abortifacient drugs in violation of the First Amendment. This is just one example of abuse of power from government. Exporting of these practices to third world countries is another abuse of power that has been going on for some time. The last administration put the brake on these policies, but they are making a comeback with the new administration. And while the hideous forced abortion policies of communist China is the most glaring example of abuse of power when it comes to basic human rights, the HHS mandate may be the most insidious. Not only does it violate the First Amendment, it tries to make something evil appear good. It treats fertility as a disease that must be prevented. We are told not to worry because religious institutions are not being forced to pay for contraception. Insurance companies are, as if insurance companies are not made up of people who have consciences. Such government mandates compels cooperation with evil and is a repugnant violation of religious liberty. Moreover, we are told that insurance companies will actually save money because we will be preventing the existence of future human beings who, of course, increase liability. By this logic, we can save lots of money by contracepting ourselves out of existence. The fourth prophecy: manipulation of procreation. Pope Paul VI warned that contraception would lead not only to governmental abuse of power, but to personal abuse of power. He wrote, "If we do not want the mission of procreating human life to be conceded to the arbitrary decisions of men, we need to recognize that there are some limits to the power of man over his own body and over the natural operations of the body, which ought not be transgressed." Sex without babies has led to babies without sex. The babies without sex industry of IVF, in vitro fertilization, where babies are treated as products rather than life flowering from love. The sterile sex of contraception has led to the attempt to normalize another form of sterile sex: homosexuality. Sanctioning of so-called same-sex marriages is justified by many as a civil right, when in fact it is an oxymoron. Marriage is about bonding and babies. Only the bodies of male and female are built for bonding. The natural result is another human being who has the right to be nurtured by father and mother who co-created her. Marriage is not a vehicle for social benefits. It's not a public announcement of sex partners. It is about forming a family unit as the building block of society. This is simply Sociology 101. As stated by Archbishop of San Francisco Salvatore Cordileone, to legalize marriage between two people of the same sex enshrines in law the principle that mothers and fathers are interchangeable or irrelevant. This, in fact, is what has been done. It is part of the confused gender ideology. The quest for unlimited dominion over one's body, ushered in by contraception, has also helped give rise to euthanasia and assisted suicide, which fortunately has been repeatedly defeated in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Unfortunately, however, this issue is not going away. The culture of death does not rest. There are many examples of the manipulation of procreation, Pope Paul VI, fourth prophecy. In vitro fertilization is one of them. Not only does IVF separate love from life, it is a highly abortive technology. Several eggs are fertilized in a lab, in a petri dish, and a lab technician decides who lives, who dies, and who is frozen to be possibly used in the future or ultimately discarded. Selective reduction is another euphemistic byproduct of the culture of death. If a multiple pregnancy results from IVF, the mother is often given the option of selective reduction, that is, killing one or more of the unborn babies so that only one or two are born. Embryonic stem cell research is another utilitarian manipulation of procreation. Life is created and destroyed in order to be used by somebody else. And even though the ethical practice of adult stem cell research is more effective at producing cures of various diseases, researchers are still moving forward, creating life only to destroy it. Third-party reproduction is yet another aspect of the ethical quagmire that is IVF. This involves the use of someone else's sperm or someone else's egg and perhaps someone else's uterus. And these extra people will have nothing to do with raising the resulting child. What's more, children born through IVF procedures have been shown to have increased health risks. And how far away is human cloning? Scientists have already cloned sheep, cattle, rats, pigs, and monkeys. How far away are we from cloning a human being who has, by definition, no parents to love him or her? Same-sex so-called marriage must use third-party gametes and automatically deprives a child of a parent of the opposite sex. All of these aberrations are byproducts of the radical individualism that expresses the so-called right for total dominion over one's own body at the expense of the common good. Such a mentality has helped give rise to assisted suicide and euthanasia. Now, it should be noted that opposition to contraception is not just a message delivered by the Catholic Church. Many people of diverse backgrounds have condemned contraception. This points to the awareness, at least subconsciously, that contraception violates natural law. Mahatma Gandhi, an Indian lawyer, anti-colonial nationalist, and political ethicist who employed nonviolent resistance to free India from British rule, he said some of the same prophetic words used by St. Pope Paul VI regarding contraception. He said, "Artificial methods of contraception are like putting a premium on vice. They make men and women reckless. Nature is relentless and will have full revenge for any such violation of her laws. Moral results can only be produced by moral restraints. All other restraints defeat the very purpose for which they were intended. If artificial methods become the order of the day, nothing but moral degradation can result." Mahatma Gandhi, like Pope Paul VI, was right. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, born to Jewish parents and an atheist as an adult, had this to say about contraception. "It is characteristic common to all the perversions that in them reproduction as an aim is put aside. This is actually the criterion which we judge whether a sexual activity is perverse. If it departs from reproduction, its aim, and pursues the attainment of gratification independently, everything that serves the pursuit of gratification alone is called by the unhonored title of perversion, and as such is despised." In Humanae Vitae, Pope Paul VI made an appeal to men of science to clarify the conditions which favor a moral ordering of human reproduction and to establish a satisfactorily clear basis for the moral regulation of offspring. Pope Paul VI further challenged men of science to show that no true contradiction exists between the divine laws for transmitting life and those for fostering true conjugal love. Many have taken up the gauntlet thrown down by Pope Paul VI. People like Doctors John and Evelyn Billings of Melbourne, Australia, two scientists who developed the ovulation method of natural family planning, which is now taught throughout the world. Another physician scientist who responded to Pope Paul VI's appeal was Dr. Thomas Hilgers. He was in the midst of his training as an OB-GYN in 1968, and he too expected that the Catholic Church would soften its prohibition of contraception. When the contrary occurred upon the release of Humanae Vitae in 1968, he decided not to dissent, as most of his contemporaries did. Rather, he embraced the teaching of Pope Paul VI, and he developed a modification of the Billings method of natural family planning. And he did this while he was at Creighton University School of Medicine in Omaha, Nebraska. This system is now known as the Creighton Model Fertility Care System. In 1985, he founded the Pope Paul VI Institute for the Study of Human Reproduction in Omaha. He and his associates have trained thousands of teachers and physicians throughout the world regarding the moral methods of family planning and treatments for a multitude of gynecological problems. I am fortunate to have been one of his students, and I apply his methods in my medical practice. His development of infertility treatments, wholly in keeping with the Catholic Church and all of its teachings, stand in stark contrast to in vitro fertilization, which is a highly abortive and dehumanizing technology. This method of natural family planning, now taught around the world, is the method adopted by my wife and me. It also is the method that I taught in my medical practice when I turned away from prescribing contraception. Many medical applications of the Creighton model were pioneered by the research of Dr. Tom Hilgers. I was one of hundreds, if not thousands, of physicians around the globe who benefited from his research. As I mentioned, we are now able to offer women more natural ways to intervene in gynecologic problems. Conditions such as abnormal bleeding, irregular menstrual cycles, endometriosis, and infertility can now be managed without resorting to artificial contraceptive methods. I will have much more to say next time about the medical applications of modern natural family planning. Until then, remember, we should always treat life with care and respect. And, at the very least, we should first do no harm.
Thank you for tuning in to First Do No Harm. Dr. Rollo welcomes your questions and comments. You may contact him at markrollo978@gmail.com. That's MARKROLLO978@gmail.com. Thank you, and until next week, remember, first do no harm.